What is a non-solicitation agreement? A non-solicitation agreement is an agreement that's usually signed between a company and an employee. And the employee is agreeing that after they leave, they will not solicit employees of the company, vendors of the company, or customers of the company. What does that mean exactly? Well, let's say the employee goes to work for a competitor, and prior to that, the employee signed a non-solicitation agreement. By signing that, the employee agreed the employee will not ask employees from the old company to go to the new company, or vendors from the old company to go to the new company, or customers from the old company to come to the new company. In other words, an employee is entrusted with the relationships of the employer when the employee comes. And the employer recognizes it would be really harmful to introduce the employee to these relationships, later have the employee leave, and have that employee then solicit those relationships and try to take that away as well. It's hard enough for an employer to lose a good employee, even a not so good one necessarily. But to then have other relationships solicited and brought over. Now you might be wondering, if the person who signs a non-solicitation agreement doesn't solicit, but someone else solicits them, is that a violation? Let's play it out. Let's say, for example, an employee signs a non-solicitation agreement, then goes to the new employer, and one of the vendors from the old employer reaches out and says, hey, we would like to serve you instead of your old company. Or maybe it's a customer of the old company reaches out to the employee and says, hey, can we continue to work with you at the new company? Is that okay? You might be thinking, well, it should be okay because there was no solicitation by the employee who transferred. But usually solicitation or non-solicitation agreements say it doesn't matter who initiates the contact. It's not just solicitation. It's also any other efforts to take away business from the original company. It would also be any other transactions or engagements with a new company. And typically there's a period of time, like 2 years, for example. Now you might be wondering, are non-solicitation agreements enforceable? They generally are, yes, in virtually every state, if not all of them. And you might be saying, but wait, I heard that non-solicitation agreements are not enforceable in some states, like California, for example. What you're probably thinking about is a non-compete agreement. So let's talk about the difference between a non-solicitation agreement and a non-compete agreement. What is the difference between a non-solicitation agreement and a non-compete agreement? A non-solicitation agreement says a person will not take relationships to a subsequent company. We're talking about the relationships that were introduced and they won't be carried over. That's non-solicitation. By contrast, a non-compete agreement is where a person cannot compete. They cannot actually do business in an area. Typically, it's geographically limited, so it might be a 10-mile radius from the former employer, or a 100-mile radius, or a 100-mile radius from any of the former employer's business locations. Are non-compete agreements enforceable? In many states they are, in fact in most states, but not all states. For example, a non-compete agreement between an employer and an employee generally is not enforceable in California. Why did I say between an employer and employee? Because there can be non-compete agreements between other parties. For example, let's say I start a business. I sell widgets throughout the United States. And I've built a lot of great relationships selling widgets, and maybe I even sell those widgets on infomercials. And then I decide to sell my company to a new buyer. And the buyer says, we'll pay you $1 million for this business, but you need to agree not to compete with us for 10 years. We don't want you starting a brand new business, competing somewhere else and under a new company, and now all the people who recognize you start to associate that goodwill with the new company. So they have me sign a non-compete that for 10 years I will not start a new business that competes with them. That is enforceable in virtually all states in all circumstances. Why? Because it's from a seller of a business to the business and to the new buyers. That's very different from employer to employee non-compete agreements, because with employer and employee, there is a bargaining power differential. In other words, the employer has a lot more bargaining power, the employee has a lot less. Whereas with a buyer and a seller of a company, there's usually much more similar bargaining power. Also, I just think legislatures in states are more concerned about protecting employees who are generally considered more vulnerable and susceptible to being taken advantage of than business owners who are selling their businesses. Let's face it, most people, when they sell their business, they have lawyers involved. They have protection. They know what they're walking into. A lot of times employees don't know what they're walking into. They didn't go to law school. They might be quite young when becoming an employee. So there are a number of states now that are either outright banning non-compete agreements or having significant restrictions on them. Right now in the Minnesota legislature, there is legislation going through that would prohibit non-compete agreements in the employer and employee relationship moving forward. So those that were signed in the past would still be in place, but moving forward, they'd be prohibited. Okay, so non-solicitation agreements, that has to do with relationships. They're enforceable. Non-compete agreements, that has to do with competition in the marketplace, just the ability to do business. That is viewed with scrutiny by the courts and not enforceable in some states. Feel free to register at aaronhall.com/free. You'll get on our free newsletter. Doesn't come out that often, and it's all about delivering important value to you, educational information that will help you avoid problems in your company and improve your life. Have a great day.